Okay, so you guys have given us a ton to unpack this week, huh? A whole bunch of stuff swirling around geopolitics in East Asia. We've got news reports, in-depth analysis, all centered on, well, how the Philippines, the U.S., and, got to mention China, are all kind of, interacting, right?
Yeah, for sure. Lots of moving pieces. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive. Go beyond just the headlines, the surface stuff. We really want to get a handle on what's actually going on, the tensions, the strategies at play, and why any of this should even matter to anyone listening.
Exactly. So, where should we even begin? I guess first, let's lay out what we're diving into today. We've got this evolving security partnership between the U.S. and the Philippines, especially with all the stuff happening in the South China Sea. Then there are all these visits by high-level officials. What are those really signaling? And then, of course, we've got to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture, right? How's China maneuvering? The U.S., Russia, too, and all the other major players in the region. So all right, let's jump in. Let's start with the U.S. Defense Secretary's trip to the Philippines. What's the deal with that?
Well, on the face of it, this visit's being framed as a response to China's actions in the South China Sea, right?
Yeah.
And they're making it very clear that the U.S. is there to back up the Philippines in terms of security. In fact, the Philippine ambassador to the U.S. even released a statement really hammering home the idea that their alliance is strong and, it's here to stay, basically. But here's the thing. I think there might be a deeper strategic play here. Something, almost like what happened at the end of World War II.
Wow. Okay, that's an interesting take right off the bat. But yeah, the ambassador did emphasize that unwavering U.S. commitment. That's for sure. And as we might expect, Beijing definitely had something to say about it, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Chinese Ministry of Defense spokesperson came out pretty quickly, basically cautioning that any kind of military cooperation between the U.S. and the Philippines shouldn't, step on the toes of other countries or destabilize the region.
Makes sense. They wouldn't just sit back and say nothing. But was there anything else that stood out from their response?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
This is the part that really caught my eye. The Chinese spokesperson also brought up the whole, history of the U.S., talking about their astonishing record of breaking promises and, let's be honest, abandoning their allies. So basically, they're throwing some serious shade, casting doubt on the whole idea that the U.S. is really this reliable partner.
It's always fascinating how history always seems to play a role in these things. It really does inform how these countries interact today. Okay, so let's move on. We also have this rather interesting and, from what we gather, not so successful visit of U.S. Senator Steve Daines to Beijing. And you drew a parallel here that I thought was really insightful, comparing this whole thing to, Zhangdan and sushi in Chinese history. So could you break that down for us a little?
Sure. So by comparing Daines' visit to the whole dynamic between Zhang Dun and Sushi, what we're really getting at is the personal nature of this whole outreach effort. I mean, yeah, Daines is a senator, but the feeling is that this wasn't really a big official government thing. It was more like a personal move by someone who's super tight with the former president, kind of like Zhang Dun and Sushi,
Yeah.
right? A close personal relationship being used to try and achieve something significant. And the fact that Trump's relying on this kind of personal connection says a lot about how badly he wants to, get back in with China. The big takeaway here is that this wasn't your typical state-to-state interaction.
Right. Right. Very much a behind the scenes kind of thing. And the outcome, as you pointed out, well, it doesn't seem like it went too well for Trump and his people, especially with China coming out right after with this announcement about their anti-foreign sanctions law.
Yeah, the timing of that was definitely not a coincidence. Right on the heels of Daines' visit, China drops these regulations on the implementation of the anti-foreign sanctions law. That's got to be a direct response to, what they saw as a pretty lame attempt by Trump to try and squeeze some concessions out of him. It basically shows just how serious China is about sticking to its principles, especially when it comes to its core interests and, its relationships with other countries. And it's not just aimed at the U.S. either. It's a clear signal to everyone else, Europe, Russia, Japan, South Korea, saying, hey, you do you. Don't let anyone push you around.
Very interesting. And we have some reports that Danes actually offered to roll back all those tariffs Trump slapped on China since 2018 if they would basically help out with stabilizing the U.S. financial situation. You called this a create a problem, solve it yourself tactic. Why is that?
Well, think about it. It's like they're saying, hey, remember that economic pressure we put on you? Yeah, we can make that go away, but only if you help us out with our own mess. Pretty audacious, right? And China's response, yeah, not so much. They weren't playing that game. They're basically saying, we're not just going to roll over because you decided to hurt yourself and now want a reward for stopping.
Okay, makes sense. So let's shift gears a bit. We also need to talk about how the U.S. is positioning itself strategically in the region. You mentioned the U.S. Defense Secretary's upcoming trip and pointed out the interesting choice of destinations: Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and then Japan. But notably missing from this Indo-Pacific swing is South Korea.
Yeah, South Korea being left out is definitely worth noting. But what's even more interesting is that the trip ends in Japan. And get this, it's timed to coincide with the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima. Now, if we think back to World War II, Iwo Jima was huge, right? Early 1945, the Allies were shifting their focus to the Pacific, getting ready to take on Japan, as it became clear that Germany was on its way out.
All right, now this is where it gets really interesting. You're saying that by ending this trip at the Iwo Jima anniversary, the U.S. might be hinting at a big strategic shift, like they think they can handle, or maybe even just, put on the back burner the whole Russia-EU situation to really go after China, kind of like what happened in 45.
Exactly. It's a pretty powerful image, right?
Okay.
And it aligns with this idea that they might be trying to nudge other countries, Europe, Russia, Japan, South Korea, to see this whole U.S.-China competition as a way to get ahead. Like, hey, while the U.S. and China are busy with each other, maybe you guys can, use that to your advantage.
Interesting. You also contrasted this U.S. approach, which you called kind of imperialist and zero sum, with China's whole thing about, everyone developing together and finding common ground. Those seem like pretty different ways of looking at the world.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. is very much about competition, staying on top, whereas China is more focused on mutual benefit, finding ways to cooperate despite their differences, and it's a fundamental difference in how they approach, well, pretty much everything on the global stage. And as for Trump's tactics, well, there's this idea that he's mostly playing for time, not really dealing with the real problems in the U.S. And that could make him look weak, both to his own people and to other countries.
So let's talk about the Philippines now. You mentioned it as a potential flashpoint in all of this, right? You connected the U.S. strategy of stirring things up in the West Pacific to both what's happening in South Korea, with President Yoon Suk-yeol facing possible impeachment, and the whole Duterte situation in the Philippines. How do these pieces fit together?
Well, the idea is that by creating instability or even just taking advantage of existing instability around China, the U.S. can weaken China's position. And some people are saying this is how the U.S. is responding to China repeatedly shutting down Trump's attempts to, get a meeting with them. Then you have South Korea. The Yoon Suk-yeol card, as they're calling it, isn't working out so well for the U.S. anymore because North Korea is getting bolder, and they have both China and, increasingly, Russia backing them up. Russia's been strengthening its military ties with North Korea, and there's even talk of them helping out in Ukraine.
Right, and Russia's getting more involved on the Korean Peninsula, which adds another layer to all of this, doesn't it?
Definitely. Russia sees this as a way to gain some leverage, in other areas where they clash with the U.S., like Ukraine and the Middle East. This makes things trickier for the U.S. when it comes to North Korea, especially with those talks going on about Ukraine and, no one wants to risk things blowing up on the Korean Peninsula. And it's interesting that it seems like the focus on the Yoon Suk-yeol card has shifted from Biden to Trump. Maybe there's some disagreement within the U.S. about how to play this.
Now, what about Duterte's return to the Philippines? You argue that this puts President Marcos Jr. in a pretty tough spot, similar to Yoon Suk-yeol. How so?
Well, there are two things at play here. First, there's the risk that the U.S. might just decide to, drop Marcos Jr. if it suits their needs. And second, Marcos Jr. might feel like he has to bend over backwards for the U.S. to stay in power and avoid any, let's just say, political headaches. This means the U.S. could potentially push Marcos Jr. to provoke China in the South China Sea and then turn around and act like the peacemaker.
That sounds pretty risky. But you also mentioned that China being so firm might actually force the U.S. to back down, especially with all the pressure on Trump from his Wall Street buddies to, get that meeting with China before April 20th.
Yeah, the thinking is that China's not budging on its core principles, so the U.S. might not have much choice. And then you add in this pressure on Trump from his financial backers. It creates this sense of urgency. And remember, you mentioned the Tokyo 118-degree line, which is the internationally recognized boundary of the Philippines. That could be a starting point for talks between the U.S. and China, a way to talk about the South China Sea without, immediately getting into a fight about who owns what.
And we can't forget the possibility that the U.S. might try to paint China as the big, bad new hegemon. But you pointed out that this could backfire on them pretty badly. How so?
If they go that route, yeah, they might get some countries to side with them against China, but they're also basically admitting that they're not the top dog anymore. And that's a tough pill to swallow, both politically and strategically. Oh, and one more thing. You brought up the idea that they might try to get rid of certain figures like Rubio or Hegseth as a way to, smooth things over with China, especially since Rubio got sanctioned by China for those comments he made about issues they consider internal matters. That could be a pretty big gesture, a sign that they're serious about wanting to improve relations.
Okay, let's talk about how all of this is connected to what's going on between the U.S. and Russia. There was news about them restarting talks in Riyadh, aiming for a ceasefire in Ukraine. And you highlighted the timing of this right after the head of the Russian Federal Security Service went to China. That can't be just a coincidence.
It's definitely suspicious. This high-ranking Russian security official visits China, and then bam, just 2 days later, his deputy's meeting with U.S. officials in Riyadh. It's almost like Russia went to China first to, get on the same page before talking to the U.S. This suggests some level of coordination, or at least close communication, which gives Russia more leverage in those talks with the U.S.
Right, so they're not going in blind. Now, there's this really bold claim in the analysis we looked at. It says that the U.S. basically can't survive without a stable relationship with China, and that pushing things too far would be suicidal. That's a pretty strong statement. Why do they say that?
It all comes down to how deeply intertwined the U.S. and China are, both economically and geopolitically. They're basically saying that playing chicken with China is a really bad idea. And remember, the Chinese embassy came out and said straight up that they're ready for anything, whether it's a trade war or something even worse. And let's not forget about all the internal problems the U.S. is dealing with right now. It makes you wonder, what does China really have to be afraid of?
It does make you think. And the final point you made was that if the U.S. can't strong-arm China into doing what they want, well, they're probably not going to have much luck with other countries either. Why is that?
Think about it. If China, this huge economic power, can stand up to the U.S., other countries like the EU, Russia, Japan, and South Korea might start thinking, hey, maybe we can get what we want from the U.S. too. They see China pushing back and think, well, maybe this is our chance.
So to wrap things up, it's clear that this is a really complicated situation with a lot of moving parts. We talked about the rising tensions in the South China Sea, the whole U.S.-Philippines-China triangle, and how Russia and all the other players in the region are maneuvering. It's constantly changing, and everyone's trying to send messages and test each other.
Absolutely. Every move seems calculated, like a chess game. And you have to factor in the historical context, the relationships between leaders, the internal politics of each country. It's a real puzzle.
And that brings us to our final thought for everyone listening. Given how much the U.S. and China depend on each other, and with all the problems the U.S. is facing right now, what do you think is going to happen in the long run? Will things stabilize, or are we headed for conflict? And what factors are going to be the most important in deciding how this all plays out? As you think about those questions, remember to consider everyone's perspective, not just the U.S.'s point of view. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.